All right, what is up, my A-Push peeps? I want to wish you a good luck in our week 6 of A-Push, as well as week 6 of your instruction across the board. You're all doing a really good job of engaging, of displaying good levels of critical thinking, of willingness to put in the work. So I want to just remind you that this work is really important and that your contribution to this class is vital. So let's buckle up and have a really, really strong 6th week of instruction. Now, last week, we spent some really quality time talking through the first experiment with a national form of government, the Articles of Confederation, which of course failed, as the system itself was put in place to be too weak to actually be effective. And we spent our live session last week talking in great detail about the crafting and ratification of the Constitution. And it's with high importance that you understand kind of how that Constitution is made, why it's made the way it is, because understanding those things with, like, for example, right, the Senate having 2 votes per state and the House of Representatives being based on population, like that's going to be really important later because that issue is built on with later issues. Likewise, understanding the checks and balances that exist and why they exist are really important as well. So last week's really important because without last week, it's hard to explain away the things that happened, for example, this week and every week going forward. So now that we have a form of government that is going to allow, for example, a presidency to take hold and to run the country as an executive, right? It's going to shift the way we study things and the way we approach things politically. Now that we have a government system that can enable the federal government to get more involved in the economy, that will shape the way in which we view economic matters, which will be part of today's conversation. So really important last week. This week equally as important. So make sure that you're paying close attention. Your content quiz, of course, I call it a quiz in quotation marks because I'm not actually quizzing you on anything except your ability to watch this movie and answer a couple questions. So do that. I was going to ask you to engage in a thesis statement this week that I'll be giving you some feedback on as well. So today we're going to talk about the early republic, the first 2 administrations, George Washington and John Adams. Now, I'm going to save most of the Adams stuff for the back half of our live session this week, but we will talk about him getting elected today and some of the political context that takes place in to inform our conversation in our live session. So let's get cracking. Now, first thing to understand is the role of women. We talked at pretty significant length during the Revolutionary War era about women like Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren and the Daughters of Liberty, right, rising to embrace new political and social and economic opportunities. And women are going to play a really key role in the new republic. Now that we have a constitution, we have a republican form of government, which I emphasized last week, just the ideas of people choosing representatives. Women are going to be very limited in their political rights, right? Like women aren't going to be given the right to vote, aren't going to be given the right to hold office, etc. And their property rights, in that women in most states can only own property if they were married and their husband passed away, if they're a widow. So women are limited on the political and the economic side of things, certainly. But we do see women embracing a new role socially, which is really important. First of all, we're going to see increased marital rights. We're going to see far fewer arranged marriages and more women either choosing their husband or choosing to stay single. So we're going to see on the social side of things a little bit of progress for women. And then on the domestic side of things in society, we're going to see this ideology called Republican motherhood, which is going to be really important to understanding kind of the trajectory of women's rights over time. As Republican motherhood really serves as kind of the starting point or the launch point for our conversation about women all year. And Republican motherhood is this ideology that, look, we have a republic. We have a government in which the will of the people is very important. And who better than women to make sure that the citizens that embrace this Republican form of government are virtuous, are willing and able to make decisions for things outside of just their own selfish interests. As we saw, one of the main criticisms of the Articles of Confederation era is that the everyday citizenry is not virtuous enough, not willing to make good, positive decisions for the community as a whole. So it'll be women that should be raising this next generation of virtuous citizens who can take the Revolutionary era generation's legacy into the future of our nation. With that, because women are going to be asked to really raise and educate their children, we see women embracing increased educational opportunities because that's going to be necessary if women are going to be tasked with this very important job of raising virtuous citizens. Then the society has the obligation to allow women to get a little more educated, which we see taking advantage of there as well. So the Republic of Motherhood, if I was going to simplify it, is this concept that a woman's role is to stay at home. So that, again, we wouldn't consider this progress by 21st century standards or even 20th century standards. But it is a role with increased priority and emphasis by society and respect by society. They're stay at home and they're going to raise the next generation of patriots, the next generation of individuals to take on the legacy of the revolution and improve the nation continuously. This is a role in society at the time we're very proud of, because women's responsibility was to teach and raise their children in Republican ideals of representative government and doing what's right for the common good, the citizenry as a whole. So that's the role of women here in this whole conversation. It is, of course, not what Abigail Adams asked for when she asked John Adams to remember the ladies in forming these new systems of government. But nonetheless, it does provide a reasonable starting point for the trajectory of women's progress over time. Now let's talk politics. So after the Constitution is ratified and approved, we see George Washington, I know you're shocked, unanimously elected as the first president of the United States. Now Washington, of course, served in the French and Indian War, served as the commander of the Patriot Army during the Revolutionary War. He served as the president of the Constitutional Convention that created the Constitution. He is the most famous, most well-known American at this time by far. So it, of course, should come as no surprise that he is elected as the first president in the United States. Now, presidencies are 4-year terms. So he serves the first term from 1789 to 1793. He is re-elected in 1792 to serve the next four years. And he serves his 2 terms as president before stepping down to retire home to Mount Vernon to enjoy fine wine and his slaves here after 2 full terms of the presidency. So we're not going to talk about the elections necessarily. We're going to talk about so many presidential elections. In this case, we're not going to talk about the presidential elections because they're unanimous. George Washington is an overwhelming favorite and wins both times hands down. So he's unanimously elected. John Adams, who of course we've spent great time talking about here as well. I just mentioned his wife, Abigail Adams. He is the vice president, who at the time, the vice presidency goes to whoever gets the second most votes for president. So the electoral college is created in a way so that people pick 2, and whoever finishes first becomes the president, second becomes vice president. So Adams becomes vice president, and he serves as vice president for both terms of Washington's presidency as well. Now, a couple really important things. I'll try to give you a slide like this for most presidencies. It gives you a quick snapshot that you need of like the need-to-know events and developments of each presidency. In the case of Washington, he's starting from scratch, right? Much like the country as a whole. There's never been a president before. So a lot of the things he's going to do are going to be really important because they're going to create a precedent or an example to follow for all these subsequent presidencies that we're going to see over the course of our nation's history with 45 presidencies to now. One of the first things he does is he creates a cabinet, which is they're formal positions of advisors that are close to the presidency that oversee a specific element of our country's policy. Okay, so his early cabinet is very small; it's only 4 men. The cabinet has grown over time to include a bunch of other positions as the country has changed. But at the starting point, there's only 4 individuals in the cabinet. The Secretary of State, who's responsible for foreign policy, our relationships with other countries, is Thomas Jefferson, who, of course, we know from writing the Declaration of Independence and the like. Secretary of the Treasury, who's in charge of the U.S. economy and our financial systems, is going to be Alexander Hamilton, who, of course, is a Revolutionary War veteran as well, and he was at the Constitutional Convention and wrote the Federalist Papers, many of the Federalist Papers, some of which we read last week, arguing in favor of a strong, active central government. Keep that in mind. Right? Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence. It's all about limited government and rights. Hamilton writes the Federalist Papers. It's all about a strong national government that is able to exert authority over people. The Secretary of War, who's in charge of the military, is Henry Knox. And the Attorney General, who is America's head lawyer, is going to be Edmund Randolph. So that's the 4-man cabinet from the jump. We're going to spend a lot of time this week talking about the conflict between these 2 dudes. Jefferson writes the Declaration. He likes liberty. Hamilton writes the Federalist Papers. He likes the Constitution. He likes order. So this conflict between these 2 is going to be really foundational to understanding the political party developments in the early republic. The 3 maybe most important events of his presidency. I'll be talking about all of them. First is the Judiciary Act of 1789, which creates a much more robust and organized legal system for our country of courts that our nation still follows, and also creates the position of the Attorney General, which he names Edmund Randolph too. The Whiskey Rebellion. We're going to have another rebellion. Hopefully this one will go differently than Shays' Rebellion, when there was not really a whole lot to do about putting down the rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion, which, I mean, what sounds more American than that? Rebelling. We do a lot of that. Whiskey. Do a lot of that. And foreign policy, some of the things that are going to be really important to foreign policy, French Revolution, Jay's Treaty, and the Pinckney Treaty, are the U.S. becoming problem solving via diplomacy, meaning via negotiations with other countries instead of wars with other countries. So that's all we're going to get to as we go. Any issues? A very important farewell address that I'll talk about a little bit as well. You'll read a chunk of it in your extension activity this week. But the farewell address, which is like his goodbye to America, his lessons learned, his warnings for the future, and he actually has some really good insight and advice for America that we'll get to this week as well. So first, we'll talk a lot in this class about laws that maybe aren't that exciting or flashy, but are important to helping understand the foundation of things. And this is the first example of that, in that the Judiciary Act of 1789 is really the first thing Congress, our new elected Congress, our new president, new House of Representatives, new Senate, our new Congress, one of their first orders of business is to make a more effective court system. As I talked about last week, the only court listed in the Constitution is the Supreme Court. And of course, one court can't handle all the legal disputes for the whole country. That would be ineffective and inefficient. So Congress creates the Judiciary Act of 1789, which organizes the whole legal system of the United States. It organizes the Supreme Court, that has, at the time, one Chief Justice, the guy in charge of the Supreme Court, and 5 associate justices who will weigh in on all things as the final court of the land. But it also established district courts and circuit courts and just ways in which our court system can be more efficient and more effective, and creates the Office of Attorney General. All right, so what it does is it creates this idea, right, in that there's just different, based on the type of case that we're dealing with, there's different ways in which the court system works itself out on the way to the Supreme Court. Now, this is not going to be necessarily incredibly important for you this year until AP Gov next year, but understanding that Congress creates a more effective legal system with the Judiciary Act of 1789 is very important. Now, the first Supreme Court Chief Justice who's created here, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, is actually going to be John Jay, another guy who we know of as a Federalist Paper author and a Constitutional Convention delegate. So he's going to play a key role in the legal side of things as well. So that's the first piece. The second piece is the French question. Now, as you may recall, as you better recall, as you do recall, the French lended us great assistance and support during the Revolutionary War, so much so that many arguments can be made that say that the U.S. does not win the Revolutionary War without French support. So very, very, very important. But then during Washington's first term, the French people have their own revolution, right? They mirror it on the United States Revolution, the American Revolution. They're going to be heavily influenced by some of the documents and the arguments of the Americans against their British imperial controllers. So the French monarchy, the king of France, is overthrown by the people, and they want to establish their own republic that looks a lot like the United States. So you should be saying, like, man, they're doing what we did. We should be helping them the way they helped us. And that's what a lot of people will be saying. But the French are going to declare themselves a republic, but the carnage, the bloodshed, the mob rule, if you will, is much heavier than what we saw in the American Revolution. Now, this is for a couple reasons. One, the U.S. is fighting against a British colonial control way back in England, whereas the French are fighting against their government there in France, right? They're not fighting against some imperial control, but it's their own government. So we see the guillotine and beheadings, and it's a very, very bloody, very ugly revolution. And that causes a lot of people to be like, we want to support them, but like, whoa, things are crazy over there. Now, Jefferson, who of course helps write the French Declaration of Independence, Jefferson and his supporters, they think it's unfortunate that these people are being killed by the mob, but probably necessary. The argument is that the ends justifies the means. The goal of having a republic is worth some bloodshed along the way. But Hamilton and his supporters, those people that really crafted the Constitution, because they were afraid of mob rule, think that what's happening in France is terrifying. Because if that inspires the mobs, the masses to rise up in America, then we might be looking at the same type of situation of mass of turmoil and bloodshed and overthrowing of society. So Jefferson and his supporters, who prefer a freer, a liberty-based society that does not have a lot of order and restraints, think the French Revolution pretty cool and we should be supporting them. And Hamilton and his supporters don't, because they don't want to set the idea that this kind of revolution should be rewarded in society as a whole. Now, as we just discussed, the U.S. has an alliance with France, but Washington is going to argue that our alliance with France is not with the French people, it is with the French king. And the French king no longer exists because he's dead, because he got killed by the mob, and therefore we have no obligation to support the French because the group, the governing body that we made that alliance with no longer exists, and therefore the alliance no longer exists, and therefore we can just stay out of this chaos. Now, the British are going to look at this in typical British fashion and say, oh, wow, there's a lot of chaos and turmoil in France. Why don't we declare war on France to get back at them for supporting our colonists in their war for independence? So the British declare war on France, and now we have the French people fighting themselves and England, and there's chaos in Europe, which is one of the reasons why Thomas Paine argues in Common Sense we should get the hell out of our English relationship, because there's always chaos in Europe. They're always fighting each other. Here they are fighting each other again. So Jefferson and his supporters, right? Jefferson is Secretary of State, so his job is foreign policy, our relationships with other countries. Jefferson and his supporters are going to push for the U.S. government to honor the alliance, to come to the aid and the support of the French like they came to our aid and our support when we needed it. But Hamilton and his supporters are going to argue that the alliance was formed with the French monarchy and therefore no longer existed. Hamilton and his supporters are actually going to openly support the British. As there, like I said a little bit ago, there's this fear of supporting a bloody and violent revolution because the last thing that these Federalists want, who just created this new, stronger national government, is that happening again in the United States. Ends up being Washington's call, as the president is the commander-in-chief. The president is our last say on these sorts of matters. Washington's going to actually side with Hamilton and issue a very important proclamation of neutrality, which means, look, France, we like you. You're cool. England, we like you. You're cool. We're not taking a side. We're going to just stay here in the United States and kick it and be neutral and hopefully trade with you both because, you know, our economy is kind of in shambles. But we're not taking a side on this conflict to support either one of you overtly. So this proclamation of neutrality is really important because it's going to set the precedent, here that word is again, the precedent that the United States should be solving their problems diplomatically, not by committing military might and forces all over the world. But the French question ends up being a really big dividing factor in society that's going to be the root of a lot of the political party debates that we see in the next couple minutes. Okay, so the French question is amongst the first things that Hamilton and his supporters and Jefferson and his supporters are going to disagree on, but that list is only going to get longer. So Hamilton and Jefferson really become the fathers of our modern political party, not modern political parties, take that back, but the fathers of our two-party system, right? You look at the United States today, we have two main parties, some other little parties running around. Little parties are just as fun as big parties sometimes, depends on who you're partying with. But moral of the story, Hamilton and Jefferson are both very influential in creating the two-party system that we see today. So Hamilton and his supporters will become known as the Federalists, and they're going to be in favor of a stronger federal government. Jefferson and his supporters will become known as the Democratic Republicans or Jeffersonian Republicans, and like their name says, they prefer a society with more democracy and less order, less stability. So the issues they're going to divide on are really here. 5 big issues. First, and maybe the most important and most enduring issue, is constitutional interpretation, which we'll talk about here in just a second. Constitutional interpretation, meaning how do we interpret, how do we really process the document that we've created in regards to how much power the federal government should have. Second issue is banking and credit. Third issue, as we've already discussed, is the French Revolution, as Hamilton and his supporters would like to support England or be neutral, and Jefferson and his supporters prefer support for France. Fourth is taxes. Who should be taxing the people, how much, and for what reasons? And the fifth ends up being one of the most divisive issues is the Whiskey Rebellion, specifically, but rebellion more broadly in general, right? Whereas if you think about even Jefferson's support for the French Revolution demonstrates his support for rebellion as an effective tool of political change. So those are the 5 issues. I'm going to go back to constitutional interpretation because it's going to be huge for the rest of the year. Very, very, very important. So there's 2 schools of thought here: a strict interpretation or a loose interpretation. So I ask you, I was growing up. I had 2 parents. I'm not going to say which one was which, but there's a strict parent and a less strict parent, a more loose parent, if you will. So anytime I wanted to do something, I'm not going to ask the strict parent. So that might help you understand like this terminology, in that my request for the power or the privilege of doing certain things, I would go to the more loose parent because, they were more likely to say yes. The same holds true for constitutional interpretations. Under a strict interpretation, the federal government has less power. Under a loose interpretation, the federal government has more power. And this, of course, comes back from last week's issue of the elastic clause, right? This ability to stretch the federal government under that necessary and proper perspective to do things that maybe the Constitution doesn't say you can do. So I put it quite simply here for you. Under a strict interpretation, the argument of a strict interpretation is that the Constitution has to explicitly, specifically, in writing, give the government the power to do a thing, whatever that thing is, for the government to have that power. So to put that the other way is that if the Constitution doesn't say the federal government can do it, they can't do it. Right? So that really takes the letter of the law. The letter of the Constitution says, okay, you want to do X, Y, and Z? That's not in here, so you can't do that. Not in there, can't do it. A loose interpretation argues from the other perspective. And it says, if the Constitution doesn't say you can't do it, if the Constitution does not specifically limit the government from doing that thing, then therefore you can. Because the loose interpretation argument is that the Constitution already says a bunch of things the federal government can't do, and therefore it leaves the rest open to interpretation. And if it doesn't say you can't do that thing, then therefore do that thing. So this strict versus loose argument is going to play a really big role going forward in a lot of political debates, but especially today on the bank. So those are the 2. Make sure you get those down. Make sure you get those really clear, because I'll be using that terminology a lot in the coming months. So among the biggest disagreements, among the biggest conflicts between Hamilton and his supporters and Jefferson and his supporters is Hamilton's financial plan. Now, as we know, the economy is in chaos. The economy sucks. One of the reasons why the Articles is so unsuccessful and why Shays' Rebellion even happens is economic turmoil. So Hamilton, as the Secretary of the Treasury, proposes his financial plan to help improve the future of the U.S. economy. And it's 3 parts. Okay, it's 3 parts, and I'll talk about all of them. The first part is funding and assuming all the states' debts that the states themselves, when they were operating like their own little independent countries, borrowing money, printing money, etc. Hamilton says, cool, New York, you owe a bunch of money. Massachusetts, you owe a bunch of money. South Carolina, you owe a bunch of money. North Carolina, you owe a bunch of money. New Jersey, you guys all owe a bunch of money. So I'll tell you what, the federal government will take on those debts and pay them for you. That probably sounds like a pretty good deal, right? The federal government's going to take my debts as the state of Virginia or the state of New York, and they're going to pay them for me? That's pretty solid. So the U.S. government, the federal government's going to fund, pay for the debts, and assume the debts, take over the debts from the states and pay them for the states. Sounds like a pretty good deal. Now, what this worries people like Jefferson is that, wait a second, if the federal government takes over the state debts and pays for them, that really reinforces that scary thought of federal government supremacy. Right? If I let somebody pay my debts for me, then I'm really admitting that they have power. No, there goes my phone. I'm talking about interpretation and the supremacy clause. They're always listening. It worries people that are in favor of states' rights, the states have more authority, that the federal government's exerting, again, more and more power over the states. But look at my data here. The U.S. owes about $81.5 million, right? And it costs, they owe $77 million. It costs about $4 million a year to run the government. The government's very small at the time. And the U.S. is receiving a tiny amount of income, enough income to pay for the running of the government, but not enough income to pay down the debt that we owe. And this income is largely coming from Western land sales, thanks to the Northwest Land Ordinance. So the problem becomes this debt's never going to get paid off, and then our economy's never going to be good because nobody's ever going to loan us money or do business with us if we owe them a whole bunch of money. So Hamilton says, we'll just pay the debts. Now, the southern states aren't going to like this as much because the southern states don't owe as much money as the northern states. But Hamilton's goal is to repay the debts to gain foreign credit. Right? You can't get credit if you don't pay your debts back, and then help establish a more successful economy. This ends up being approved. Congress approves. Washington approves. And boom, just like that, Hamilton's plan for funding and assuming state debts goes into play, and we can start the process of getting this debt paid off for all the states. Now, in return, the southern states who are largely upset about this, the southern states get in return, because everything's a compromise in politics, and especially right now, the southern states get in return the U.S. Capitol, which had been moving around New York, Philadelphia. There was no established place. The U.S. Capitol is going to move to a southern state, Washington, D.C., which is, of course, right on the border between Virginia and Maryland, two southern states. So that's the first part of his financial plan. The second part is a bank. He wants to establish a national bank, the Bank of the U.S. Now, this bank's going to operate to do a couple really important things. First, it's going to hold all the government funds, hold and manage the government's money. It's going to circulate a uniform, a consistent national currency, we now know as the dollar. It will lend money. It'll loan money to the government when the government needs money to run. And it's going to be privately owned. So the government's not going to own the entire bank, but the U.S. government would own 20% of the bank, and the wealthy, rich people in society that have enough money to start a bank would own the other 80%. So this makes good financial sense, but again, it worries Jefferson and his supporters that again, here the elites are, right? It's like the anti-federalist criticism of the Constitution. These elites, these rich people are going to have all the power in this bank and all the power in the economic system of the U.S., and that's worrisome. That's worrisome. So Jefferson is going to be strongly anti-bank, right? He's going to say, wait a second, here's my interpretation piece. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say the government can make a bank. And since it doesn't say the government can make a bank, the government does not have the power to make a national bank. Because the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights, which we talked about last week, the 10th Amendment says all powers not given to the federal government are saved or reserved for the states. And since no power was given to the federal government to make a bank, therefore it is a state power to make banks. Right, here's that strict interpretation, right? And that, of course, runs in conflict with the Elastic Clause, which says Congress has all powers necessary and proper for carrying out its duties. Hamilton argues, taxing is our duty. It says that. Therefore, we should be able to make a bank because those two things are really interconnected. So Hamilton uses that necessary and proper clause, or the Elastic Clause, which argues that the federal government has the power to pass any law necessary for running a government. All right, it's a looser interpretation. So here we are. This might help you understanding what's happening so far. The Federalists are engaging in a looser interpretation of the Constitution. The Democratic Republicans are asking for a stricter interpretation, which leaves more powers to the states. Washington is going to accept Hamilton's argument. He's going to sign the measure into law, creating the first bank of the United States in a 20-year term. And this becomes a really big sectional problem, right? The northern states are going to like the bank because the northern states are going to become more based on commerce and industry and trade. The southern states are going to dislike and distrust the bank because they're going to be more based on cash crops and agriculture and have less need for banking to regulate their economy. So Hamilton's financial programs, here's round two, have again divided the country into one group versus the other group. Thus, to a great extent, economic disagreements are going to be the foundation of the first political parties. Cool. So the third piece of his financial plan, the first was the assumption of state debts. The second was the bank. The third is like, how's the government going to make more money so the government can actually pay off these debts and have money to even put in that bank we just created? And this is twofold. It's a tax and a tariff. Now, there's going to be a tax on whiskey, an excise tax, which means the producer pays the tax on the good. So there's going to be a whiskey tax, pretty straightforward. But also, he's going to create a protective tariff, And a tariff is an import tax, a tax on a good that we're buying from another country. This protective tariff is going to promote American industries because people will be much more likely to buy goods from home when they have to pay a tax on goods from overseas. So as we talked about under the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. baby industries are having a hard time keeping up because British goods are cheaper than American goods. Well, a tariff should fix that problem, make British goods more expensive, so people are more likely to buy American goods. So it looks like this, right? If I'm, and this is just a real elementary description, but if American cloth costs $4 a roll and British cloth costs $4 a roll, maybe we buy the British cloth because it's a higher quality at the same price. But if we add a tariff of 25%, a $1 tariff, now the British cloth costs $5 a roll because the import tax is paid. And now people are more likely to buy American cloth because it's cheaper, and now we're supporting American industries. So that's the third part of his piece is a tariff and a tax. Now this again is going to piss off the South because it's very obvious that this is meant to promote American industry, industrialization, and that all of that is happening in northern states, not southern states. So again, we have the assumption of state debts can piss off the South because they don't have as many debts, and now federal tax money is going to pay for those debts. The bank pisses off the South, and third, the tariff pisses off the South as well. I'd argue back to that the South got the 3/5 compromise, the slave trade compromise, and all those other things in the Constitution, so they should be not so angry, but here we are. So people are mad. People are mad specifically about this whiskey tax. And what do Americans do when they get mad? They have a rebellion, specifically about taxes. So this tax on whiskey is going to cause what's called the Whiskey Rebellion. And we see Western Pennsylvania frontier farmers, right, out on the frontier where most of these rebellions take place. Bacon's, Shays, whiskey, all frontier rebellions. These Western Pennsylvania farmers are going to attack the tax collectors who are there to collect the whiskey tax. It's going to be a period of unrest and unruliness. And this really is a crisis of legitimacy. A crisis of legitimacy for the federal government. Because if they just let people not pay the tax and attack the tax collectors, then what does that say about how powerful this federal government actually is? Right? Likewise, if they just let this happen, doesn't this mean that we're right back in a position of the Articles of Confederation where the federal government can kind of just be pushed around by mob rule? So what Washington and Hamilton do is they overreact on purpose, right? As a show of force. They're going to overreact and send a bunch of federal troops to go out to Western Pennsylvania farms and show the people that you have to pay this tax, and if you don't, the army's going to show up. All right, this again asserts federal authority over the lawlessness, arguing that the people, the public, are welcome to protest laws and denounce laws and say laws are wrong, but they have no real right to just not follow them and or attack the people that are trying to enforce them. So there's a fine line, right, between protest and rebellion. The Federalists are going to argue here that protest is fine. Protest the tax law all you want, but by no means should you be rebelling and attacking tax collectors. Now, this is really going to upset Jefferson and his supporters because he's going to argue that the military should not be being used to put down people's right to protest, and rebellion is healthy for a republic because it keeps things fresh and new, and it keeps the government in check, and thus he's very upset that the federal government overreacted to this rebellion. This is going to make Jefferson very popular to the Western frontier, less rich farmer class, which is going to play a role in his presidential election in 6 years after this in 1800. Okay? So this is what gives us our first political party system, which is going to take us for our first 35 years of the country, of Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. Now, the Federalists are going to be in favor of all those things you see on the column: stronger national policies, a strong central government, using a loose interpretation to get there, to make sure that if the federal government can do anything that the Constitution doesn't say that it can't. They're going to be in support of commerce and manufacturing and early industry. And in general, the Federalists are going to be supported by the rich in cities, people that are able, the people that are educated, the merchant class, the banking class. The elites of society are going to be pro-Federalist because their policies benefit them. They're going to be on foreign policy, pro-British. They want to keep us close with England because Hamilton and his supporters argue that England's political system and economic system is strong and effective. We should follow that. And we're going to see their geographic support in the Northeast, like New England, New York, Massachusetts, etc., where we see industrialization taking place. The Democratic Republicans are going to be in favor instead for states' rights, right? A limited central government with stronger local and state governments with a strict interpretation, right? The federal government can only do what it says in the Constitution that they can do. They're going to be supported much. They're going to be in favor of an agricultural style economy. Jefferson uses the phrase the yeoman farmer, the yeomanry, which is a word I'll use a ton this year in class. Just ask any of my last classes. The yeomanry is really important to understand here. And that's just the small, self-sustained, everyday farmer that Jefferson and his supporters look at as the ideal American. Now, we don't need to be banking and industrialization and manufacturing. That the real legacy of America is the yeoman farmer. Of course, there will be more support in rural areas, largely supported by small farmers, plantation owners, and the artisan or the working class. And they're going to be very anti-British in their policies and in favor of intervention in the French Revolution. Shouldn't surprise us there either. And not shocking, based on what I've just said, their region of support is strongest in the West, the New West that as we're spreading out, and in the South, where there is, of course, more agriculture. So that's our political party system that we'll spend a whole bunch of time on in our live session this week, so make sure that you're at least framed through this understanding. A couple other important elements to note of Washington's first two terms. Most of his presidency is defined by the French Revolution question, the economic questions, as well as setting these precedents for the rest of the presidencies to come. His foreign policy, though, is noteworthy as well. College Board asks that you have a decently strong understanding of the U.S. relationship with other countries at this time. Now, the U.S. is very weak, right? Don't really have a big army, don't really have a big navy, don't really have any money. But we also don't have anybody we need to fight, right? Because all of the countries that have given us problems or support in the past are way over in Europe. So Washingtonian foreign policy is built on diplomacy, on negotiations, on using a conversation instead of conflict, okay? So the first thing that backs up my argument there is the Proclamation of Neutrality, which is keeps the U.S. out of the French Revolution and out of the France versus England conflict, which is really important. Keeps us neutral, but it pisses off both sides. The French are pissed at us. The British are pissed at us. Everybody's pissed at us. We want to just trade with both countries to make our economy more successful, and this is going to lead to impressment, a really important term in the early republic, all the way through the War of 1812, which we'll get to next unit. Now, impressment is when a country steals your cargo, say the U.S. is trading with France. The British Navy intercepts that cargo, takes that cargo, steals that cargo, and impresses or forces those sailors that are on that boat into the British Navy as parts of the British Navy. So we're going to see impressment happening by the French and the British, and the U.S. is kind of powerless to stop it because our military is so weak, our economy is so weak, and we don't have a whole lot of credibility. So the Proclamation of Neutrality is important, pisses off both sides, leads to impressment. John Jay's treaty, the Jay Treaty in 1794, we send John Jay over to England to negotiate a stop to this impressment. Like, hey, you can't do that. Jay goes over to tell them to stop impressment, and England basically tells them to get lost. They're like, oh, you want us to stop that? You're going to make us stop that? No, you're not going to make us stop that? Cool, we're going to keep doing that then, because you're trading with France, and that's our enemy. So the Jay's Treaty accomplishes not what it was set out to do, but it does get the British to agree to leave their posts, to leave their forts that we talked about on the U.S. frontier, out in the west. And by negotiating a treaty with the British, that makes the French more mad. Which we'll get to a little bit in the beginning of period 4. And the Adams administration, which we'll talk about in the live session this week. But good news, because we negotiated a treaty with England, that scares the Spanish. Spain's like, oh, this is worrisome. If the U.S. and England are getting in good, right? England has control for Canada, U.S. has control of the U.S. Like that's worrisome for us as the other European power that still has big colonies there in the Western Hemisphere. Spain just like gives the U.S. what they want without really a negotiation in the Peace Treaty. Spain, I put in quotes, oh crap, the U.S. is getting cool with England. We should be friends with them too, so we don't get caught in this conflict. So Spain does what they wouldn't do under the Articles of Confederation and opens up the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans to U.S. trade, which solves a problem that existed under the Articles that could not be solved because U.S. foreign policy was so weak. So all three of these demonstrate again that the U.S. is engaging in diplomacy instead of conflict to solve their problems. But all three of these do demonstrate that the U.S. does not have a whole lot of credibility in the world. because of our lack of force and our lack of influence economically, militarily, etc. So Washington leaves office. Washington leaves office after 2 terms, and he leaves us with a set of precedents that many, almost all of our presidents will follow in their terms. First, he serves 2 terms and then he leaves. Right? There's no rule that says the president has to only serve 2 terms. That rule will come much later in the 1930s. But every president after this honors this precedent, this legacy of only serving for 2 terms, because nobody wants to be the president that served longer than George Washington. Second precedent or legacy is the phrase Mr. President, which we use to address the president and have used ever since Washington. Now, some Federalists that are in favor of like elite type rule are going to argue that he should go by like His Excellency the President of the United States and some dramatic title. And Washington's like, no, we're not playing that game, right? Mr. President is fine, which does, of course, make the president seem more approachable and less on a pedestal like a king would. His third precedent is the cabinet, this group of select advisors that's going to head these executive agencies like the State Department, the Treasury Department, Jefferson Hamilton, Fourth precedent is neutrality, which is a really important precedent. The U.S. should stay out of foreign conflicts that aren't theirs. The fifth is a positive, strong relationship with Great Britain that, for the most part, the U.S. has enjoyed throughout its history, except for we're going to have one more little blip coming up when we fight them again in the War of 1812. And his last precedent is the giving of a farewell address, the giving of a speech to the American people that urges them to learn some lessons and to look forward in a specific way, whatever that president has to say. The 4 themes of his farewell address are really important. First, it emphasizes optimism, that America's come a long way and we have a lot to do, but we're headed in the right direction. His second piece of farewell address is kind of funny because it's already too late for that. He says, avoid political parties. Political parties are dangerous for the country. This partisanship, us against them, is not good, so you should avoid that, even though, of course, by now it's already happening. Third, he urges against sectionalism, which is like this North versus South divide that is coming. Right? It's not just slavery, but it's banking, right? And tariffs and all these other issues that are dividing the North and the South. Washington says, don't do that. Right? We're all the same country. Treat it like that. And his fourth is quite possibly most important, as he says, stay out of European problems. Right? Europe's going to always have their conflicts. They're going to fight with each other. You want to be friends with everybody. You want to trade with everybody, but make no permanent alliances. Agree to no country that you will come to their aid in a time of conflict, because then you'll be dragged into conflicts that you didn't start and aren't your fault. So these are the urgings he gives for the American public before retiring to his private life. And the election to replace him shows that America has listened to none of these things. Right? We see John Adams as a Federalist running against Thomas Jefferson as a Democratic Republican. And look at this. The northeastern states and the Atlantic seaboard, they all vote Federalist for John Adams. The West and the South, like I just told you, vote Democratic Republican. So we've already seen political parties, and we're already seeing sectionalism, North versus South conflict, here in this first election to replace George Washington. John Adams takes the White House at the time, which would be hilarious now, no longer is the case. The person that finishes second in the presidential election becomes the vice president. So now Adams and Jefferson, after running against each other and hating each other and being very opposed to each other on policies, are now the president and the vice president. So John Adams takes office. He's, of course, from Massachusetts, which is up here in the north, and thus shouldn't be surprised that he is a Federalist. He's also quite possibly America's ugliest president ever, because, my God, look at that guy. And his vice president, who's supposed to be his closest supporter, is from Virginia, the South, is a Democratic Republican, not a Federalist. And this divide is going to increasingly cause tension in the Adams administration, which I will talk about in our live session this week. So, big takeaways: Washington's presidency, what caused the parties, Hamilton's financial plan, the Whiskey Rebellion, the French Revolution. You got that down? You're good to go. See you tomorrow for Cohort A or Thursday for Cohort B, and have a great rest of your day.